For 35 years, my life was defined by the steady tick of a clock and the dry smell of old ledger paper. I was Arthur Miller, the man who handled the messy finances of half the small businesses in the city. My office, Miller and Company, wasn't just a place of work. It was my sanctuary. I had spent decades balancing the books for people who didn't know the difference between a credit and a debit, helping families save for college, and ensuring small shops didn't go under when the tax man came knocking. Last Friday, I finally turned the key in that heavy oak door for the last time. I handed it to the building manager, felt the cool metal leave my palm, and walked toward my car with a sensation I hadn't felt since I was a teenager. Absolute, unfiltered freedom. My chest felt light, as if a literal weight had been lifted from my ribs. I was 64 years old, and for the first time in my life, I didn't have a single deadline looming over my head. To celebrate, I decided to do something a bit out of character. I've always been a man of simple tastes, but tonight felt like it deserved something special. I stopped by a high-end butcher shop and bought 2 thick, beautiful ribeye steaks. They cost me nearly $50, a price that would have made my younger self faint, but I didn't mind. I also picked up a bottle of expensive red wine, the kind that usually sits on the top shelf gathering dust. When I got home being the house I shared with my daughter, Sarah, and her husband, Mark, I set to work. I pulled out the good plates, the ones with the silver trim that had stayed in the back of the cupboard for years. I ironed a linen tablecloth and even found a pair of candles to put in the center. I wanted this to be a moment we all remembered. I wanted them to share in my pride. "Dinner's ready," I called out. Sarah came down first. She was still in her business suit, looking frazzled from her day as a marketing executive. She glanced at the table, her eyes widening slightly at the decor, but she didn't say anything about it. Mark followed a few minutes later, his nose buried in his phone as usual. They took their seats, and the room was filled with the sound of clinking silverware as I served the roasted vegetables and steaks. I cleared my throat, my heart thumping with a bit of nervous excitement. "I wanted tonight to be special because I have some big news," I started, remaining on my feet. "As of 4 o'clock this afternoon, Miller and Company is officially closed. I've retired." I expected a cheer, or at least a congratulations, Dad. Instead, there was a heavy, uncomfortable silence. Sarah stopped chewing. She looked at me, her eyebrows shooting up. "You retired? Just like that? You didn't even talk to us about it?" "I've been thinking about it for a year, Sarah," I said, my smile faltering. 35 years is a long time. I'm ready to relax. Mark looked up from his phone, his eyes narrowing. "Wait a second. If you've closed the firm, what's happening to your income? I assume you've got a massive pension coming your way? I mean, you own the place." I sat down and took a sip of my wine, trying to keep my voice steady. "Well, I've got my Social Security. It'll be about $1,300 a month. It's not a fortune, but I've always been careful. It's enough for my needs." The silence that followed was even heavier than the first one. Sarah and Mark exchanged a look, a quick, sharp glance that seemed to communicate an entire conversation in a split second. Then Sarah laughed. It wasn't a kind laugh. It was a sharp, biting sound that made me flinch. $1,300? Dad, are you serious? My monthly car payment is nearly that much. You can't possibly think you're going to survive on $1,300 a month in this city. "I don't need much, Sarah," I replied, feeling a flush of heat rise up my neck. "I own my car. I don't have any debts. You manage to not need much because you live here," Mark interrupted, his voice dripping with a new, aggressive tone. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. "We don't charge you a dime in rent. We pay the utilities, the internet, the property taxes. You've been living on our dime for years, Arthur." I felt like I'd been slapped. "I helped you buy this house, Mark. I put down $75,000 12 years ago, so you too could qualify for the mortgage." Sarah slammed her fork down on the table. "That was a gift, Dad. You said it yourself back then. This is to help you start your lives. You can't just bring that up now because you made a stupid decision to stop working without a real plan." "I have a plan," I started, but Sarah cut me off again. Her face had hardened into an expression of cold pity. No, Dad, this is a problem. A big one. We can't afford to support a dependent. We have our own lives, our own goals. If you're not bringing any real money into this house, you're a liability. Mark nodded in agreement, a smug, satisfied look growing on his face. Sarah's right. We've talked about this. If you want to keep living under this roof, things have to change. We aren't running a retirement home for free. I stared at them, the expensive steak suddenly tasting like ash in my mouth. What are you saying? Mark leaned forward, his eyes cold. It's simple. You have two options. Option 1. You stay here but you earn your keep. That means you're the cook, the cleaner, and the groundskeeper. You handle the laundry, the bathrooms, the grocery shopping, and the yard. You make yourself useful so we don't have to hire help. You'll be a live-in servant, essentially. I felt the room tilt. And option 2? Option 2 is you find somewhere else to go, Sarah said, her voice flat and emotionless. There are state-run facilities for people in your income bracket. Or you can find a tiny studio in a bad part of town. But we aren't subsidizing your lifestyle anymore. You're serious, I whispered. After everything I've done for you, you're giving me an ultimatum like this? We're being realistic, Arthur, Mark said, standing up and picking up his plate. He hadn't even finished the steak I'd spent $40 on. Think it over tonight. Let us know in the morning if you're ready to start your new duties, or if we need to help you pack. He walked into the kitchen, his footsteps heavy and confident on the hardwood floors I had helped pay for. Sarah stood up too. She reached over and patted my shoulder, a gesture that felt more insulting than if she had hit me. Don't be so dramatic, Dad, she said softly. We're actually trying to help you. You're just too proud to see it. Good night. She followed her husband, leaving me alone in the flickering candlelight. The celebration was over. I sat there for a long time, staring at the congealing grease on the plates and the half-empty bottle of wine. They thought they had me cornered. They thought I was a broke old man with nowhere to turn. What they didn't know, what I had never told them, was that my modest life was a choice, not a necessity. They didn't know about the 6 properties I owned across the city. They didn't know about the trust fund sitting in a Vanguard account with over $10 million in it. I stood up, my back straight and my jaw set. I didn't say a word as I walked down the hall to my small, cramped bedroom. I closed the door and sat at my desk, pulling out a folder I kept locked in the bottom drawer. It was time to stop being the generous father and start being the accountant again. And as an accountant, I knew exactly how to settle an unbalanced ledger. I spent the first hour after that disastrous dinner simply sitting on the edge of my bed, listening to the house settle around me. Through the thin walls of my tiny room, a space barely 150 square feet, I could hear the muffled sounds of their evening routine. Footsteps thudded overhead, water hissed through the pipes, and eventually, the distant, canned laughter of a sitcom began to bleed through the drywall. It was the sound of a family moving on with their night, completely unbothered by the fact that they had just told their father he was either a servant or a vagrant. When I finally stood up, it wasn't out of defeat, but with a cold, sharp purpose. I am an accountant. My world is built on order, evidence, and the undeniable truth of numbers. I walked over to the small, 2-drawer filing cabinet I'd brought with me 12 years ago. The metal drawer opened with a familiar, protested squeak, revealing folders meticulously arranged by year and category. I pulled out the folder marked 2013, House Purchase, and carried it to my desk. On top sat a yellowed wire transfer receipt. I remembered that afternoon vividly. Sarah was 25 and desperate to buy a home before the local market outpaced her and Mark's modest savings. They had found a solid 2-story house, but the bank required a 30% down payment, $150,000, and they only had half. Sarah had called me, sobbing with a distress I believed was genuine, terrified they'd lose their dream home. I had wired the $75,000 the very next morning. In the memo line, I had written, "Home down payment with love." At the closing, she had hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe promising she'd never forget what I'd done. I set that receipt aside and reached for the 2018 emergency assistance folder. This one was thicker. Inside were copies of checks totaling $23,000, spread across 4 months when Mark had been downsized from a corporate job. They had missed 3 car payments and were facing repossession. I had stepped in, paid off their car loans, and cleared 2 maxed-out credit cards they'd been using for groceries. "You're a lifesaver, Dad," they'd told me then. Then came the 2016 wedding folder. The invoices were a testament to Sarah's desire for a perfect day at a venue overlooking the river. Catering, flowers, a string quartet, and an open bar with top-shelf liquor. I had paid for every cent of it. $30,000 total, because people told me a father only gets that moment once. My hands slowed as I reached for the final folder, the one I kept buried at the bottom. 2019-2022. Timothy, Medical. This was the hardest ledger to read. It contained receipts for a specialized preschool and stacks of bills from the children's hospital. My grandson, Timothy, had been diagnosed with leukemia just 2 weeks after his 2nd birthday. I had funded experimental procedures and specialist visits that insurance wouldn't touch. Clipped to the back was the funeral home invoice. Timothy James had lived for 3 years, 2 months, and 14 days. For those brief years, we had been a family united by hope. After his death, we became a collection of people divided by grief. I had kept writing checks for Sarah, hoping generosity might rebuild what loss had shattered. I pulled out a calculator and a legal pad. My fingers moved automatically, adding up the years of help. House down payment $75,000. Debt bailout $23,000. Wedding $30,000. Appliances, renovations, and unpaid loans $89,400. The final total was $217,400. I underlined it twice. That was the amount I had invested in their lives, given freely because I believed that's what a father does. And in return, they had laughed at my Social Security check and told me to take out the trash. I stared at that number until my eyes burned. Outside my window, the city streetlights cast long, orange shadows across my modest room. My reflection in the glass showed a 64-year-old man who looked like he had nothing. But looking rich and being rich are 2 very different things. I had spent my life living modestly, driving a 15-year-old Toyota because I valued security over status. I thought I was setting an example. Instead, Sarah had only learned to worship waste and mock frugality. It was time for a different lesson. I turned back to my desk and reached for the 2nd drawer, the one with the heavy lock. My fingers found the small key I always kept in my pocket. I opened it and pulled out a thick folder labeled simply, Properties. I spread the contents across the desk. 6 property deeds for buildings across the city. I added up their values, $4.2 million. Then, I pulled out the most recent statement for my investment trust, $10.5 million. Total net worth, $14.70 million. I could buy the very house we were sitting in with cash and barely notice the dent in my accounts. I could move to a villa in Tuscany or a penthouse in the Pearl District tomorrow. But that wouldn't teach them anything. They thought I had only 2 options: serve them or leave. They didn't realize that money, real money, buys a 3rd option: control. I locked the drawer, the metallic click sounding like a gavel. I knew I needed professional help to execute this properly. I needed someone who understood property law and the messy details of co-ownership. By the time the sun began to peek through the gray Portland clouds, I had found my man, a real estate attorney named Robert Chun. Mark and Sarah thought they were playing a game of checkers with a tired old man. They had no idea I'd been playing chess for 35 years, and I was about to put them in checkmate. I spent the next 48 hours doing what I do best: research. I didn't want just any lawyer. I needed a specialist who understood the specific, thorny mechanics of real estate disputes, co-ownership conflicts, and partition actions. I approached the task methodically, filtering through reviews and legal records until a name kept appearing: Robert Chun. He had 15 years of experience in property law and a reputation for being direct and incredibly efficient. On the morning of June 18th, I called his office and set a consultation for the very next day. That evening, I prepared my audit of the situation. I gathered the wire transfer receipt for the $75,000 down payment, the original property deed, and my bank statements. I even typed out a precise timeline of every major financial contribution I had made to Sarah and Mark's lives over the last 12 years, including the conversation at the dinner table. I organized it all in a tabbed folder, exactly how I would have prepared a file for a high-stakes client audit. Chen's office was located on the 9th floor of a sleek glass building downtown. I arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in a sharp button-down shirt and pressed slacks. I didn't want to look like an old man looking for a handout. I wanted to look like a man conducting a business transaction. The office smelled of expensive coffee and leather-bound books. A receptionist led me to a conference room where Robert Chun sat, a sharp-eyed man in his mid-40s with a firm grip. "Mr. Miller, please," he said, gesturing to a chair. "Tell me what's going on." I laid out the folder and told him everything. The mockery of my Social Security income, the ultimatum to become their live-in servant or face the street, and their dismissal of my $75,000 contribution. Chun listened without a word, making occasional notes. When I finished, he reached for the property deed and tapped a line with his pen. "You are listed as a co-owner with a 50% interest," he said. "Not as a lender, not as a guest. As a legal owner. Without a written loan agreement, that $75,000 is legally considered a gift in the eyes of the court," Chen explained. "You can't sue them for repayment of the cash. However, the deed changes the entire game. You aren't a creditor asking for money back. You are an owner seeking to dissolve a co-ownership. Under the law, we can file a partition action." He explained that because the house couldn't be physically cut in half, the court would force one of two things. Either they buy out my 50% share at fair market value, or the court orders the house sold and the proceeds divided. Chun pulled up recent sales in their neighborhood. He estimated the house was worth about $470,000, meaning my share was roughly $235,000. "We start with a formal demand letter," Chun said. "We give them 30 days to either buy you out or list the property. Most people settle once they realize they can't win." I hesitated, then mentioned Mark's handyman side business. I estimated he made at least $15,000 a year in cash that never saw a tax return. Chen's eyebrows rose. He called that tax fraud and warned me that reporting it to the IRS was a nuclear option. It was a separate path from the property, but a powerful one. "Let's start with the demand letter," I decided. "I'm asking for what I own." I pulled out my checkbook and wrote a check for the $3,500 retainer without a moment's hesitation. For my secret accounts, that was a rounding error. For Sarah and Mark, it would represent a financial catastrophe. "Once this letter goes out, your relationship with your daughter will change forever," Chen warned. "It already did," I replied. "They made their choice at dinner. I'm just making mine now." The very next day, I didn't wait for a response. I packed 2 suitcases and my filing cabinet and moved into a 9th-floor corner unit in a building I owned in the Pearl District. It was a modern apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river. I planned to rent it out, but for now, I claimed it for myself. For the first time in years, I woke up in a room that wasn't a marginal space. On June 24th, my phone finally rang. It was Sarah. I let it ring 3 times before I answered. "Hello, Sarah," I said calmly. "What is this, Dad?" Her voice was high-pitched and vibrating with panic. "We just got a letter from a lawyer. You're suing us." "I'm not suing yet," I said. "I'm exercising my rights as a co-owner. You have 30 days to find the money to buy me out or agree to sell the house." "That money was a gift," she screamed. "You can't do this. We don't have $200,000. If it was a gift, why is my name on the deed?" I asked. "Gifts don't come with 50% ownership stakes." I heard the phone being snatched away. It was Mark now. "Grover, this is absurd. You're really going to do this over money you gave us a decade ago. You made it clear I wasn't welcome in that house unless I was your servant," I said. "My voice as cold as the river outside my window. So I'm cashing out." You can hire your own lawyer, but mine is quite certain about the law. If you do this, you're dead to us, Mark barked. You'll never see your daughter again. I haven't really seen her for years anyway, I replied. Just someone who looks like her but treats me like hired help. Goodbye, Mark. I hung up and turned off the ringer. I stood at the window and watched the city lights begin to glow. Across town, they were panicking, frantically searching for money they didn't have. Here, in my real home, I was finally at peace. The clock was ticking. They had 30 days to realize just how powerless they truly were. While I settled into my new life in the Pearl District, the atmosphere across town in the house I still technically half-owned was beginning to resemble a pressure cooker. I had officially moved into a 9th-floor corner unit of a building I'd purchased back in 1997 for a mere $120,000. Today, that same property was worth $800,000, and this specific unit usually commanded a monthly rent of $2,800. For the first time in 12 years, I woke up without the sound of heavy footsteps overhead or the muffled, tense arguments of a marriage under strain. I unpacked my things slowly, placing my clothes in a real closet rather than a narrow alcove and setting up my desk to face the sweeping views of the Willamette River. It was the taste of absolute freedom, flavored by expensive espresso and the quiet dignity of a man who was finally in his own space. Meanwhile, Sarah and Mark were entering a world of pure, unadulterated desperation. As June turned into July, they began a frantic, doomed trek through the financial institutions of Portland. They truly believed that because they had lived in that house for over a decade, they could simply walk into a bank and borrow against it to pay off the old man. They had no idea how the world of finance actually viewed them. Their first stop was the credit union where they had secured their original mortgage 12 years prior. They walked in with a sense of entitlement, but the loan officer quickly dismantled their illusions. Together, they earned about $120,000 a year, which sounded like a lot until you looked at their $280,000 mortgage balance, 2 car loans, and a mountain of credit card debt. Their debt-to-income ratio sat at 43%. Most responsible lenders wouldn't touch anything over 36. "We have equity," Mark had argued, his voice likely rising in that way it did when he felt cornered. "Nearly $200,000 of it." The officer's response was a cold bucket of water. To access that equity through a refinance, every co-owner, including me, would have to sign off on the new loan. And even if I were willing, their combined income couldn't support the massive jump in monthly payments. They left that office with nothing but a pamphlet on debt management and a growing sense of dread. Over the next week, they visited 3 more banks, receiving the same rejection at every turn. The missed car payments from 5 years ago, the very ones I had paid for them, still haunted their credit reports like ghosts of their own irresponsibility. When the banks failed them, Sarah turned to her social circle. I can only imagine those phone calls, the forced laughter, the family emergency excuses, and the awkward requests for temporary loans of $20,000, $30,000, or even $50,000. She called old college roommates she hadn't spoken to in half a decade and friends they had vacationed with just months prior. Every single conversation ended in a polite but firm no. One friend was particularly blunt, asking why they should risk their savings if the banks wouldn't risk a loan. By July 5th, their social network was exhausted. No one was willing to hand over a fortune to save people who clearly couldn't manage their own lives. As their options dwindled, their relationship began to disintegrate in real time. The house they were so desperate to keep became a battlefield. Sarah blamed Mark for his arrogance at the dinner table. Mark blamed Sarah for not having any savings of her own. They stopped sleeping in the same bed, the silence between them only broken by the sound of Mark coming home late from bars or Sarah sobbing into her pillow. While they were busy tearing each other apart, I decided it was time to deploy the second strike. Mark had often bragged at family dinners about his off-the-books construction and handyman work, laughing about how he was beating the tax man by taking cash payments that never touched a tax return. I had kept that information tucked away for a rainy day, and that day had finally arrived. I am an accountant by trade. I have a fundamental respect for the rules that keep society functioning. On July 7th, I downloaded IRS Form 3949A, the information referral form, and filled it out with professional, clinical precision. I reported Mark's name, his address, and a conservative estimate of $15,000 in unreported annual income over the last 3 years. I cited my personal observations as the basis for my knowledge. I didn't use the mailbox in my building's lobby. I drove 2 miles away to a nondescript postal box in a busy part of the city. As I dropped the envelope into the slot, the metallic clang of the mail door felt like a final period at the end of a long, painful sentence. By July 10th, they had been searching for 2 weeks and had only 20 days left before the deadline I had set through my attorney. They sat at the same dining table where they had once mocked my poverty-level income, surrounded by rejection letters and maxed-out credit card statements. A calendar on the wall had July 24th circled in red, the day their world was scheduled to end. I stood at my window that evening, watching the city lights dance on the dark water of the river. I knew they were panicking, and for the first time in years, I wasn't the one who had to fix it. They had offered me a choice between servitude and exile. I had chosen a different path entirely, and the walls were finally closing in on them. The silence in the house was finally broken on the morning of July 11th, but not by a reconciliation. It was broken by the sharp, insistent knock of a mail carrier. Mark was the one who answered the door, blinking against the mid-morning sun as he was asked to sign for a piece of certified mail. When his eyes fell upon the return address, Internal Revenue Service, his stomach didn't just drop. It felt as though it had turned to lead. You don't receive certified letters from the IRS unless the news is catastrophic. He tore the envelope open with trembling fingers while Sarah watched from over his shoulder. The words on the page were cold, clinical, and devastating. They had been selected for an examination of their federal tax returns for the years 2022, 2023, and 2024. Specifically, the government was investigating potential unreported income from cash payments received for services rendered. The letter demanded a mountain of documentation they simply did not have: bank statements, receipts, and a full list of clients. The audit was scheduled for August 8th, giving them exactly 3 weeks to prepare for an inquiry that had no good answer. Mark set the paper down on the kitchen table as if it were a live explosive. "This is him," he hissed, his voice cracking with a mixture of terror and fury. "Your father did this. He reported me." Sarah didn't argue. She simply stared at the letter, her mind racing through the same calculations I had already performed. If Mark had failed to report $15,000 every year for 3 years, the back taxes would be around $8,500. With penalties and interest added on, roughly another $3,500, they were looking at a new bill of $12,000. It was money they didn't have, piled on top of the $235,000 they were already struggling to find. By July 14th, Sarah reached her breaking point. She couldn't stand the way Mark looked at her, the way the house felt like it was shrinking, or the terrifying silence from her father. She found my new address on the lawyer's letterhead, a building on Southwest Nato Parkway in the Pearl District. She drove there that afternoon, parking her car and looking up at a towering structure of glass and steel. It was a modern architectural marvel, the kind of place with a doorman and restricted access. A place she assumed I could never afford in 1,000 years. She checked the intercom directory, her heart hammering against her ribs. There it was, Peterson A. Unit 9004. She pressed the button. "Hello, Sarah." My voice came through the speaker, calm and entirely unsurprised. "Dad, it's me. Can I come up?" she asked. There was a long pause, a silence that felt like an eternity, before the buzzer sounded. "9th floor," I said. The elevator was a quiet, mirrored tube of stainless steel that moved so smoothly she barely felt the ascent. It opened directly into my apartment, the kind of luxury reserved for corner units that occupied an entire floor. When she stepped out, she froze. The space was immense, an open floor plan with granite countertops, professional-grade appliances, and leather furniture that looked untouched. But it was the windows that took her breath away. Floor-to-ceiling glass that spanned 2 walls, offering a panoramic view of the river, the city bridges, and the distant mountains. I was standing by the counter, slowly preparing a cup of coffee. "How?" she whispered, her voice barely audible as she gestured to the room. How long have you lived here? I moved in after our last dinner, I replied, pouring water into the espresso machine. I own this unit. In fact, I own the entire building. Sarah walked to the window, needing to touch the glass to prove it was real. You said, at dinner, you said your income was only $1,200 a month, she stammered. You let us believe you were poor. I told you my Social Security amount, which is exactly $1,200, I said, handing her a small cup of espresso. I never said it was my only source of income. You made that assumption because I chose to live modestly. I watched as she took the cup automatically, her hands shaking too much to drink. But why live in that tiny room for 12 years? She asked. I wanted to set an example, I told her, sitting down in a leather armchair. I wanted you to see that a rich life isn't about what you spend. It's about what you build and the security you create. Your mother and I worked for 35 years to build this. I thought you'd learn by watching. I was wrong. Dad, please, she said, and finally, the tears began to fall. Not the strategic tears of a woman trying to get her way, but the heavy, exhausted tears of someone who had lost everything. We can't pay the $200,000. And now the IRS. We're going to lose the house. You'll have your half of the proceeds from the sale, about $235,000. I said, my voice remaining level and factual. You can find a smaller place. Many people live on far less than that. I'm your daughter, she pleaded. You are the daughter who laughed in my face when I mentioned $1,200. I reminded her. You had a choice between respect and contempt, Sarah. You chose contempt. Forgiveness requires remorse before the consequences hit, not after you've been backed into a corner. She set the untouched coffee down and walked back toward the elevator, unable to find any words that could bridge the chasm between us. I watched her go, the doors sliding shut with a soft, expensive hiss. 10 minutes later, she was sitting in her car on the street below, dialing Mark's number. He's rich, she sobbed into the phone. He's been rich this whole time and we never knew. Mark, he planned all of this. But Mark wasn't ready to surrender. Then we fight, he growled through the line. We get our own lawyer. We prove that the money was a gift. They were still trying to play the game, but they didn't realize the board had already been cleared. I apologize for the length of the previous section. Here is a significantly expanded and more detailed version of Part 6, focusing on the legal intricacies and the psychological toll on Sarah and Mark, ensuring it meets your requirements for a longer, more immersive narrative. #### Part 6. The weak defense. The realization that I was actually a multimillionaire didn't just shock Sarah. It seemed to light a fire of pure, desperate rage in Mark. He wasn't ready to accept that the burden he had tried to enslave was actually the one holding all the cards. While I sat in my quiet apartment, they were living in a house that felt like it was shrinking by the hour. By July 18th, their desperation led them to a small, cramped office in a suburban strip mall, the only kind of legal counsel they could afford now that the banks had slammed their doors. The office was a far cry from Robert Chen's sleek, glass-walled suite. It sat between a dry cleaner and a discount nail salon, smelling of old paper and stale cigarette smoke that drifted in from the sidewalk. Their attorney was a man who looked like he hadn't slept since the late 90s, his desk disappearing under a mountain of disorganized case files. He charged them $500 just to sit down and listen to their story, a sum they had to scrounge together from the change in their kitchen jar. He spent an hour reviewing the documents Sarah had brought, the yellowed wire transfer receipt and, most importantly, the property deed. He sighed, pushing his glasses up onto his forehead, and looked at them with a pity that was almost harder to bear than my coldness. The deed is the problem, he told them bluntly. Your father is listed as a 50% owner. In the eyes of the law, the gift argument is almost entirely irrelevant because he isn't suing you for the return of the $75,000. He is simply exercising his rights as a titled owner of the property. Mark leaned forward, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and disbelief. But he hasn't paid a dime toward the mortgage in 12 years, he argued, his voice likely rising as it always did when he felt cornered. Can't we argue he abandoned his interest? He just lived there like a guest, eating our food and using our utilities. The lawyer shook his head slowly. Under Oregon law, non-contribution to mortgage payments doesn't negate titled ownership. He's an owner, plain and simple. No judge is going to strip a man of his property rights just because he didn't help you pay off your loan, especially if his name was put on that deed voluntarily at the start. He told them that fighting this would cost them several $1,000s in legal fees, money they clearly didn't have, and that, in the end, they would almost certainly lose. But Mark and Sarah were beyond logic at this point. They were motivated by a toxic mix of fear and the same pride that had started this entire mess at the dinner table. They pulled out a credit card, one that was already hovering dangerously close to its limit, and maxed it out to pay the lawyer a $2,000 retainer. The response he drafted for them was more of a plea than a legal defense. It spoke of undue hardship, claimed again that the initial money was a gift, and suggested that I had abandoned my claim to the house. It was a weak, flimsy document, and everyone in that room likely knew it was nothing more than a stalling tactic. They filed it on July 23rd, just 24 hours before the 30-day deadline expired. That evening, Robertson called me. I was sitting on my balcony, watching the sunset paint the Willamette River in shades of violet and gold. The city looked peaceful from this height, a sharp contrast to the chaos I knew was unfolding in the house I had left behind. They've hired an attorney and filed a response, Arthur, Chen said. It's exactly what we anticipated. A lot of talk about fairness and very little actual law. They're trying to buy time, but it won't work. We can proceed with the petition action now. Are you certain you want to do this? Chun asked, his voice softening slightly as he performed his final due diligence. Once we file the petition, it becomes a public record. There's no taking it back quietly. It will end in a forced sale or a buyout. I'm certain, Robert, I said, my voice as steady as a balanced ledger. File it. I'll have it in the court system tomorrow, he promised. We should have a hearing date within 6 weeks. I hung up and poured myself a glass of 20-year-old single malt whiskey, a bottle I'd been saving for a day that never seemed to come. I stood at the window and raised the glass toward the city lights, toward the house where Sarah and Mark were likely sitting in a suffocating, angry silence. They thought their response had given them leverage. They thought they were fighting back against a petty old man. In reality, they had only bought themselves a front-row seat to their own collapse. They still had the IRS audit looming over them in August, and now, a court date that would officially decide the fate of their home. The second strike had landed, and as an accountant, I knew how to read the trajectory of a failing business. They were insolvent, not just financially but morally. The endgame had begun, and for the first time in years, I wasn't the one who had to worry about the balance sheet. I was just the one who had to watch the numbers fall into place. The courtroom was smaller and more clinical than I had imagined for a moment of such personal magnitude. We were in the Multnomah County Circuit Court on the 4th floor, a room filled with the hum of flickering fluorescent lights and the faint, sterile scent of floor wax. The SIL of Oregon was mounted behind the bench where Judge Patricia Morrison would soon decide the fate of my daughter's home. Sarah and Mark sat at the table to my left with their exhausted-looking attorney, a man who seemed to be wearing a suit 2 sizes too large. Robert Chen and I sat on the right. Sarah didn't look at me. She stared at her hands, which were folded tightly in her lap. Mark, however, couldn't stop fidgeting, his jaw working as if he were trying to chew through a piece of bitter granite. When Judge Morrison entered, the room went silent. She was an efficient woman with sharp, bird-like movements and reading glasses that hung from a silver chain around her neck. She didn't waste time on pleasantries or dramatic pauses. Case number 25, Civ 8847, Peterson versus Hayes and Morrison, she announced, her voice echoing off the dark wood paneling. This is a petition for partition of real property. Robert Chen stood first. He was calm and methodical, presenting our case with the cold, unyielding precision of a surgeon. He admitted the property deed into evidence, pointing out my name and my clear 50% ownership interest. He cited Oregon Revised Statute Section 105.405, explaining that because the house was a single-family dwelling, it could not be physically divided in any practical way. Therefore, a judicial sale was the only appropriate legal remedy to settle the dispute. Then it was their turn. Their attorney stood up, but his heart didn't seem to be in the fight anymore. He tried to argue the gift angle again, claiming that my initial $75,000 had been given freely and that my 12 years of living there without paying the mortgage constituted an abandonment of my interest. He spoke about fairness, the sanctity of the family unit, and the undue hardship a sale would cause the young couple who had worked so hard to build their life there. Judge Morrison didn't even look up from the documents as she interrupted him. "The deed is the only document that matters here, counselor," she said flatly, her voice cutting through his emotional plea. "Mr. Peterson is a titled owner. Oregon law does not require a co-owner to contribute to another owner's debts, such as a mortgage, to maintain their ownership status. Non-payment of the mortgage is legally irrelevant to titled interest." She made a few final notes on her pad, the scratch of her pen sounding unnaturally loud in the silent room. "I find for the plaintiff. The defendants have 45 days to purchase Mr. Peterson's 50% interest at fair market value, as determined by the court-ordered appraisal. Failure to do so will result in a judicial sale of the property, with the proceeds divided according to ownership interest. Court is adjourned." The sound of the gavel hitting the bench was like a gunshot. I saw Sarah flinch, her shoulders slumping as if the very roof of her house had finally collapsed onto her. Outside on the courthouse steps, the midday sun was harsh, unforgiving, and bright. Their attorney mumbled a brief, embarrassed apology about the weak legal position and hurried away, leaving them standing there alone in the heat. Sarah was crying now, real heavy tears, and Mark looked like he wanted to punch the marble pillars behind him. I walked past them to where Robert Chun was waiting at the curb. "The appraisal will likely confirm the value around $470,000, Robert said quietly as I approached. "That means your share is $235,000. They have until September 10th to pay you, or the house goes to auction." As I drove back to my apartment in the Pearl District, I felt a strange sense of emptiness rather than the joy I expected. I had won. I had been vindicated by the highest authority in the county. But as an accountant, I knew that every win has a hidden cost, and the goodwill account of my family was now officially bankrupt. I made a pot of coffee and stood at my floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the tugboats move slowly along the gray river. I knew exactly what they were doing across town. They were looking at that 45-day deadline and realizing it was just as impossible as the 30-day one had been. They had no money, no credit, and now no legal recourse left to them. While they scrambled to find a hard money lender who would charge them 18% interest just to pay their mounting IRS bill, I sat in the profound silence of my own success. The house I had helped them buy was now officially listed for sale, a realtor's sign planted in the lawn I had watched Mark neglect for years. The pressure of the situation acted like acid on their marriage. Sarah moved out on August 15th, and just 3 days later, she filed for divorce. That same day, Mark lost his job. His manager had grown tired of the frequent court appearances, the phone calls, and the constant, angry distractions. I sat in my apartment that evening, listening to the updates from Robert Chen's paralegal. I felt no triumph, only the cold, hard satisfaction of seeing the numbers finally balance out in the way they were always meant to. They had built this collapse themselves, one arrogant choice at a time, beginning with that dinner in June. The gavel had fallen, and now, all that was left was the final cleanup of their broken lives. While I established my new world in the Pearl District, the old world I had left behind was disappearing into a fog of debt and litigation. I woke up every morning to the sound of the city waking up, the distant hum of traffic on the bridges and the soft whistle of the wind against my floor-to-ceiling windows. My apartment was a masterpiece of modern design, filled with light and the quiet dignity of a man who no longer had to hide his success. I had spent 12 years playing a role, living in a small room and driving an old Toyota, all to set an example that my daughter had completely failed to understand. Now the masks were off and the numbers, the cold, hard facts I had spent my life mastering, were beginning to speak for themselves. By the middle of August, the realtor they had hired, a woman named Jennifer, called me. She sounded professional but weary, the kind of exhaustion that comes from dealing with sellers who are watching their lives unravel in real time. "Mr. Miller," she said, "we have an offer. It's for $455,000. Given the current market and the fact that the court case is public record, I strongly recommend that we accept it." I told her it wasn't my decision to make, but that I would accept my share of whatever the final sale price turned out to be. I knew exactly what that meant for Sarah and Mark. As an accountant, I could see the spreadsheet in my head before the ink was even dry on the offer. The mathematics were absolutely brutal, and they were the direct result of every choice my daughter and her husband had made since that night in June. The sale price was $455,000. From that, you had to subtract the realtor's commission of roughly $27,000. Then came the heavy hitter, the remaining mortgage balance of $280,000. But the real killing blow wasn't the mortgage. It was the emergency loan Mark had taken out to pay his IRS bill and keep their heads above water for a few extra weeks. That predatory, high-interest loan stood at $50,000. When you subtracted all of that, the fees, the mortgage, and the bad debt, the total remaining equity in the house was only $98,000. Because the court had ordered a 50-50 split based on our titled ownership, Sarah and Mark were looking at a payout of just $49,000 each. 12 years of mortgage payments, 12 years of supposedly building a life. And they were walking away with less than the $75,000 I had given them for the down payment in the first place. I sat in my leather chair, a glass of water in my hand, and looked out at the river. I thought about the irony of it all. They had tried to turn me into a servant to save their lifestyle, and in doing so, they had triggered a chain reaction that had destroyed that very lifestyle. The $49,000 Sarah was about to receive wouldn't even cover a year of rent in a decent part of the city, let alone buy a new home. She had gone from being a homeowner with a burden for a father to being a single woman with a small pile of cash and nowhere to go. The collapse of their marriage had been just as rapid as their financial ruin. Sarah had moved out of the house on August 15th, taking only what she could fit in her car and moving into a small, cramped apartment belonging to a friend. She filed for divorce 3 days later, citing irreconcilable differences, a legal term for the fact that their shared arrogance had finally turned them against one another. Mark, meanwhile, was spiraling. On August 18th, he was fired from his job. His manager had finally had enough of the court dates, the angry phone calls, and the general air of toxicity that Mark brought into the office every day. I heard these updates through Robert Chen's office, and each one felt like another line item being settled on a very old ledger. I didn't feel happy about it. There is no joy in watching your child's life turn into a wreckage of bad debt and broken promises. But I felt a profound sense of rightness. For 35 years, I had watched people try to cheat the numbers, try to live beyond their means, and try to treat others as if they were disposable. The numbers always win in the end. They always balance. I imagined Sarah sitting in her friend's apartment, looking at the same math I was looking at. She must have been thinking about that dinner. She must have been thinking about the moment she laughed at my $1,200 Social Security check. She had thought she was the one with the power, and that I was the one who was trapped. Now, she was the one facing a future with no job, a pending divorce, and a payout that wouldn't even buy her a new car. I poured myself a whiskey that night, not to celebrate, but to acknowledge that the lesson was almost complete. The legal system had done its job. The IRS had done its job. And the bank had done its job. I had reclaimed my dignity, not by shouting or pleading, but by simply standing up and taking back what was legally mine. At 64, I felt older than I ever had, but also lighter. I had spent my life building security for a family that didn't respect the effort it took to create it. Now, I was finally building it for myself. The house was sold, the marriage was over, and the debts were being called in. The second strike had landed with the force of a tidal wave, and the water was finally starting to recede. The next morning, my phone rang. It was a number I hadn't blocked because I knew, sooner or later, this specific call would have to happen. It was Sarah. The phone rang on the afternoon of August 22nd. I was sitting in my living room, the late summer sun casting long, golden rectangles across the hardwood floors of my Pearl District apartment. I had spent the morning reviewing my property management reports, a task that usually brought me a sense of order and calm. But when I saw Sarah's name on the screen, my heart gave a heavy, unfamiliar thud. I hadn't blocked her number because I knew this moment was an inevitable part of the ledger. I let it ring 3 times, the sound echoing in the quiet space, before I finally pressed the button and held the phone to my ear. "Hello, Sarah," I said, my voice as level as I could make it. "Dad." Her voice was small, fragile, and stripped of the sharp, entitled edge it had carried for years. "Can I come see you? Just me, not Mark. I need to talk to you. Please." I looked out at the river, watching the way the sunlight danced on the dark water. I could have said no. I could have told her to talk to Robert Chin. But I wasn't interested in being a tyrant. I was interested in being a teacher. "Tomorrow afternoon," I said. 2 o'clock. She arrived exactly on time. When the elevator doors opened directly into my living area, she stepped out looking completely diminished. Gone was the expensive business suit and the polished marketing executive persona. She was wearing simple jeans and a worn sweater, and she hadn't bothered with makeup to hide the dark circles under her eyes. She looked like a woman who had spent the last several weeks finally tallying the true cost of her choices. She stood in the center of the room, her hands empty except for her car keys, and looked around at the expansive views and the high-end finishes she now knew I owned outright. "Come in, Sarah," I said, gesturing toward the leather sofa. She walked to the window first, standing there for a long moment as if needing to ground herself in the reality of the height and the view before she could face me. When she finally turned around, her eyes were red-rimmed, but she wasn't crying yet. She sat on the very edge of the couch, her back straight and her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I don't know where to start," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "except to say that I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Dad." I sat in the armchair across from her and remained silent. I knew as an accountant that sometimes you have to let the other party present their full statement before you can begin the reconciliation. "I'm sorry for that dinner," she continued, the words coming faster now. "I'm sorry for laughing at you. I'm sorry for treating you like you were disposable, like a burden we were graciously putting up with. For years, I took everything you offered, the down payment, the wedding, the money when Mark lost his job, the bills for Timothy, and I never once stopped to ask what it cost you to give those things to us. I never once said thank you in a way that mattered." She looked down at her hands. "I used you as a wallet, Dad. Mark told you to be a servant, and I didn't stop him because I was too arrogant to see the truth. I thought you were poor because you lived modestly, and I looked down on you for it. I never understood that you were actually the only one among us who was truly secure." The tears finally broke then, trailing down her cheeks as she looked at me with genuine remorse. "I wasn't a good daughter," she sobbed. "I don't expect you to forgive me, and I'm not here to ask for money. I needed you to know that I finally understand what I did." I let the silence hang in the air for a moment, letting her words settle into the room. I thought about the 12 years I had spent in that small room, watching her grow more entitled. With every check I signed, I thought about the $217,000 I had invested in a family that had offered me servitude in return. "I didn't do this to destroy you, Sarah," I said gently. "I did it to teach you. There is a fundamental difference between punishment and a lesson. Punishment is about making someone suffer for the sake of suffering. A lesson is about showing someone the natural consequences of their actions so they can grow. You've learned that wealth isn't about what you spend. It's about having choices and security. You saw modesty and thought it meant weakness, but it was actually my strength." I stood up and walked to my desk, retrieving a document I had prepared several days earlier. I slid it across the coffee table toward her. "The house is selling, but after the mortgage and the bad loans, you and Mark are only going to walk away with about $49,000 each," I said. "That's not enough for either of you to start over properly. This document is an offer to buy out your entire share of the house, yours and Mark's, for a total of $200,000. She stared at the paper, her breath hitching. "Why? Why would you do that after what we did?" Because you came here and took responsibility, I told her. Because mercy isn't about what someone deserves. It's about creating a possibility for something better. This money will allow you to settle your debts, pay off the IRS for the audit, and have a cushion to start a life on your own terms. Not on my money, but on your own earnings and choices. I leaned back, watching her process the enormity of the gesture. This isn't a gift, Sarah. This is closure. You need to leave that marriage because staying with Mark won't allow you to become the person you're meant to be. I already filed for divorce, she said quietly. Good. I met her eyes with a firm, steady gaze. If Mark settles his taxes and makes things right with the government, I won't pursue any further legal action against him. But the two of you need to walk your own paths now. She picked up the document with shaking hands. Do you think, someday, we could have a real relationship again? She asked. As father and daughter, not as people fighting over a deed? We're having a conversation right now, I said. That's a start. Real relationships take time to rebuild after the ledger has been so badly unbalanced. But it's possible if you keep growing. When she stood to leave, I walked her to the door. I didn't hug her. It was too soon for that. But when I offered my hand, she took it and squeezed it firmly. It was a handshake of formal respect, a recognition of a new footing between two adults who finally understood one another. I watched the elevator doors close, and for the first time in months, the weight in my chest felt as though it had finally balanced out. The lesson was over. The cleanup had begun. And for the first time in 35 years, I felt like I was more than just an accountant. I was a father who had finally taught his child the most important value of all. 1 week after that pivotal conversation in my Pearl District apartment, the legal and financial dust began to settle. The buyout I had offered was processed with the kind of clinical efficiency only an accountant and a high-tier lawyer can manage. I met Sarah one last time before the final papers were signed at a quiet, sun-drenched coffee shop in the Pearl District. The atmosphere between us was different. No longer charged with the electricity of a pending lawsuit, but settled into a quiet, careful respect. Sarah had already moved into a small, one-bedroom apartment in the Montevilla neighborhood. It was a far cry from the sprawling suburban house she had fought so hard to keep, but as she sat across from me, she seemed lighter. She pulled out her phone, not to scroll through social media or check her status, but to show me a budget spreadsheet she had built herself. "Look, Dad," she said, her voice filled with a shy kind of pride. She walked me through her columns. Income here, fixed expenses there, and a modest but consistent savings goal at the bottom. I can actually make this work on my own salary. I don't need the extra checks. I don't need to live beyond what I earn. I looked at the screen and then back at her. That knowledge is worth more than a 10-bedroom mansion you can't afford, Sarah, I said. Security isn't about the size of the building. It's about the math inside of it. She nodded, finally understanding the lesson I had tried to teach her for 12 years through my own modest living. We talked about ordinary things. My plans to finally use some of my savings to travel through Europe and perhaps spend a few months in a villa in Tuscany. She asked genuine questions about my property portfolio, curious about how I had selected the buildings and managed the risks over 3 decades. For the first time, she wasn't looking at me as a wallet. She was looking at me as a mentor. When it was time to go, she stood up and gave me a brief, meaningful hug. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered. "Thank you for teaching me, even though I know it hurt us both to get here." I watched her walk away, her head held higher than it had been in years. Then I drove back to the house that had been the epicenter of our family's collapse. I had purchased the property completely using $200,000 of my own capital, buying out both Sarah and Mark's remaining interests. The realtor's sign was gone. The for sale status was a thing of the past. The house was now fully, legally, and officially mine. I spent that evening on the back deck, a space I had watched Mark neglect for over a decade. I had a cup of coffee in my hand and a book I had been meaning to finish, but mostly, I just sat in the silence. The garden needed tending, the weeds had grown tall, and the roses needed pruning. But it was a task I looked forward to. There was no longer any tension in the air. There were no muffled arguments echoing through the walls. No sense of being a guest in a home I had funded, and certainly no one demanding I take out the trash to earn my keep. I thought about the journey that had started back in June with a celebratory dinner and 2 ribeye steaks. I remembered the way Mark had leaned back and told me I had 2 options: be a servant or go begging. They had thought they had cornered a weak, broke old man. They hadn't realized they were dealing with someone who had spent 35 years mastering the flow of capital and the weight of the law. I had reclaimed my dignity. That was the true profit of this entire endeavor. It wasn't about the $14.7 million in my accounts or the 6 buildings I owned across Portland. It was about the fact that at 64, I had refused to be diminished. I had spent most of my life building security for others, my clients, my daughter, my grandson, and I had forgotten that I deserved that same security and respect for myself. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in deep oranges and soft purples. The house was quiet, and for the first time in 12 years, it felt like a home rather than a hiding place. I had taught Sarah that money is about control and choices, but I had taught myself that dignity is something you must be willing to fight for when the people you love try to take it away. I took a final sip of my coffee and stood up, walking back into the house. I had a lot of work to do, rooms to remodel, a garden to fix, and a whole world to see. I wasn't just a retired accountant with a $1,200 Social Security check anymore. I was Arthur Miller, a man of independent means, standing on his own ground, and finally, after all these years, the ledger was perfectly balanced. Thank you for watching.